This lack of organized religion amongst the denizens, the European of this land for the first 50 years set a norm. Manning Clark makes that argument, others do. A standard for Australian spirituality and expectation about religion, and that is low temperature religion to be the norm. Don't get excited about it. The first white settlers, or the first European settlers in Australia, came from a very lowly churched UK. They were not church people themselves. Church attendance, church life, etc. was a very low ebb in the late 18th century. And so they came out not being church, not being particularly religious, to a society that had very few clergy, very few churches, virtually none at all immediately. And so for 50 years, really, until about 1840, they were on their own. They were in charge of their own spirituality, insofar as they had one, in charge of their own relationship with God, and were managing that in their own way. The norm they set was one that was basically uninstitutional, anti-organizational, and what I call low temperature. That is, religion's there, but it's something you don't get too excited about. If you get excited about it, Australians get worried. And so that sets a basic tone. And I want to talk about a few basic sociological drivers of change that are operating at this point to take and make more specific about Australia and the future of religion in Australia at this time. And the current drivers, sociological, are demographic, cultural, and marketplace competition. Demographic, migration, we all know about it, changed the composition and produced diversity in the land. In terms of demographics, the big one, of course, has been migration, bringing, in the first case, a lot of people for the Christian churches to be new members and to require assistance in settling into Australia, etc., and churches were very active in that particular social service. That began to recede in the 1960s when religious diversity became much more the product of migration, where people who weren't Christian came and established their religions within Australia, setting up, undermining that sort of Christian monopoly, particularly the British Protestant monopoly. But the other demographic in this has been a failure of the churches to retain people who were born into them. 41% of those born Anglican have now called themselves no religion. Now that's a huge loss and represents the loss of 2 generations. If you look at the aging statistics, very large proportions of the Uniting Church and the Anglican Church are over 60, close to 50%. And that's just those who identify. If you look at who's actually in the pews, it's even older than that. And so you get this aging component as the sort of demographic size shifts down. These people aren't being replaced by young people. Young people are either going elsewhere or nowhere at all. And so that aging demographic, the failure to retain, the failure to reproduce, is a major driver to the shifting away from Christendom and the breaking down of the reality behind any notion of a British Protestant majority or major influence in this country. Our latest survey that Christian Research Association published on If You Get Networks showed that less than 50% of Australians are nominating a Christian denomination at this time. And that reflects adults, that takes the kiddies out who are being called Christians by their mothers, who probably never will get there anyway. I did predict in 2021, fewer than 50% of Australians will call themselves, or that will identify with a Christian denomination. I've discovered that that's perhaps already true because the recent social science survey has discovered that that's precisely the case. Anglicans might be 11%. Protestant groups will probably be about 4%, the old mainline Protestant groups, and the Catholics maybe about 20–21%. Other religious groups about 8%, and so with the nuns, the NONESs, 25 at least. And so things are changing at a demographic level substantially, and that changes the basis for our culture. Our relationships are characterized by fear in the 21st century, so this zone called the secular, in which we contest for space, is one dominated by fear. And we have groups who fear their loss of control, influence, and impact. As with all major changes, one of the major reactions is fear. People are worried about what's going on, and some would like to reach back and re-Christianize Australia, or go back to that old compact and set that up again and make that work, or cling to symbols. And so as the reality recedes, there is this clinging to symbols, like having the Lord's Prayer open the Parliament as opposed to prayers of many different groups, as has been proposed. That's just a symbol. I mean, clinging onto that is some kind of way of saying this is a Christian country, or we still have influence. And there are other dog whistle kind of politics going on around sexuality and other things that are visibly driving the churches apart and becoming contestation points. But they're points of competition for piety points, or piety scoring over against each other, as opposed to being genuine contributions to building up a society, or genuine contributions to building up justice or mercy or peace within this land. And we're very critical consumers of religious goods, actually. Religious goods are for sale all over the place, bookstores, etc. Spirituality, and the Christianity stuff is up there. Pilgrimages, plaques, icons, it's go, go, go business out there. Religious consumers, or religious and spiritual consumers, are much more critical now than they were before. Very much more critical. They're educated, they're informed, they know of alternatives, and they have alternatives, and they're willing to choose. And they'll pick and choose. I'll have some of this and some of that, or I'll have some of this and none of that. And they're being much more critical in it. But the basis on which they're choosing is more and more likely to be experiential. What is my experience? What do I experience if I walk into your church or synagogue or mosque? What do I experience if I do this or that? And does it feel good? Does it make me feel good? Does it make others feel good? And that's the basis of judgment. So that whole experiential basis, as opposed to some kind of reasonable thing or giving over to an authority, is the basis on which these people are deciding. So what's the future looking like? Further decline for mainstream Protestants. Yes, decline for Catholics. Loss of a Christian majority in every sense. Well, the future is certainly going to be continued decline in the British Protestant sphere, continued or increased decline amongst Catholics as the declines begin to hit there. There will be innovations and change and things that we can't even begin to imagine coming up. The spiritual life of Australia is still very alive and vital. It's just exceedingly difficult to hoover up a bit of it into a corner and charge admission, especially if that particular bit you have is 19th and 20th century kinds of bits, as opposed to stuff crafted for the 21st century.